What happens when arrogance meets hidden genius? When the world's most celebrated pianist decides to humiliate a young prince in front of hundreds of elite guests, expecting an easy victory over someone he assumes is just another spoiled royal? This isn't just another story about music or royalty. This is about the moment when assumptions shatter like glass, when talent emerges from the most unexpected places, and when one night changes not just two lives, but an entire kingdom's understanding of what true artistry means. You're about to witness the most shocking musical confrontation in royal history. A challenge issued in mockery. A response that defied every expectation. And a revelation that left a room full of nobles speechless and a famous pianist questioning everything he thought he knew about music, talent, and respect. The keys are about to be struck. The music is about to begin. And nothing will ever be the same again. Are you ready to discover what really happened that night when Prince Louis stepped up to the piano bench and changed the world forever? The grand ballroom of Château de Versailles had never seen such magnificence. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors that reflected the golden glow of 1,000 candles. Tonight was special, even by royal standards. King Philippe had commissioned Europe's most celebrated pianist, Monsieur Alexandre Dubois, to perform for the court's most prestigious gathering of the year. Prince Louis stood near the tall windows, watching carriages arrive in the moonlit courtyard below. At 19, he was tall and lean, with thoughtful dark eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing little. Unlike his elder brother Henri, who thrived in the spotlight of court life, Louis preferred the shadows. He found the endless social games exhausting and hollow. Another evening of pretense, he murmured to himself, adjusting the silver buttons on his deep blue velvet jacket. The formal court attire felt like armor he was forced to wear, protecting him from a world that never quite made sense to him. The sound of approaching footsteps made him turn. His personal valet, Marcel, approached with careful steps. "Your Highness," Marcel said quietly, "your father requests your presence in the receiving line." The guests are beginning to arrive. Louis nodded, though his stomach tightened. These gatherings were always the same. Nobles would bow and scrape, offer empty compliments, and engage in conversations that meant nothing while plotting behind each other's backs. Everyone wore masks of politeness that barely concealed their true intentions. As they walked through the corridors toward the main ballroom, Louis could hear the growing murmur of voices. The kingdom's elite had gathered from across France and neighboring countries. Duchesses in silk gowns that cost more than most families earned in a lifetime. Dukes with perfectly groomed beards and calculating eyes. Ambassadors speaking in diplomatic riddles. All of them hungry for influence, for favor, for any advantage they could gain in the complex web of court politics. King Philippe stood at the entrance to the ballroom, his imposing figure commanding respect even in casual conversation. His beard was perfectly trimmed, his ceremonial uniform decorated with medals that told the story of a lifetime spent in service to France. Despite his royal bearing, there was warmth in his eyes when he saw his younger son approaching. "Louis," the king said, placing a firm hand on his son's shoulder. "I know these events are difficult for you, but your presence matters. The people need to see their future leaders." "Of course, father," Louis replied, though they both knew Henri was the heir apparent. Louis was the spare, the backup plan, the prince who would likely live his life in his brother's shadow. It was a role that suited him in many ways, allowing him freedom from the crushing weight of expectation that Henri carried. The first guests began arriving in earnest. Lord Beaumont, a man whose wealth came from textile factories that employed children in terrible conditions, bowed deeply while his eyes assessed Louis for any sign of weakness or opportunity. The Countess de Montclair, whose husband had died under suspicious circumstances, offered a smile that never reached her eyes as she calculated how a friendship with a prince might benefit her complicated legal situation. Louis played his part, offering polite greetings and making appropriate small talk. But his mind wandered, as it often did during these gatherings. He found himself thinking about the music he had been learning, the pieces he practiced in the privacy of his chambers when the castle fell quiet at night. Music had become his refuge over the past 3 years. What had started as mandatory lessons with the court music master had evolved into something much deeper. Louis discovered that when he sat at the piano, the chaos in his mind quieted. The notes created patterns that made sense in a way that court politics never did. In those moments, he wasn't a prince or a spare heir or a disappointment to his more charismatic brother. He was simply someone creating something beautiful. The irony wasn't lost on him that tonight's entertainment centered around piano music, yet no one in the room except Marcel and his music teacher knew about his growing passion for the instrument. Louis had kept his studies secret, partly from a desire for privacy and partly from fear that his father would see it as a frivolous pursuit unworthy of a prince's time. "Your Highness," came a voice that dripped with affected sophistication. Louis turned to see Baron de Rochelle approaching, his thin frame draped in an elaborately embroidered coat that probably cost more than most people's homes. The Baron was known throughout the court for his sharp tongue and his ability to find weakness in others. "Baron," Louis acknowledged with a slight nod. "I trust you're as eager as the rest of us to witness Monsieur Dubois's performance," the Baron continued, his pale eyes studying Louis's face for any reaction. "They say he's the finest pianist in all of Europe. Perhaps even the world." "So I've heard," Louis replied carefully. He had indeed heard of Alexander Dubois. The man was a legend, a musician whose concerts sold out within hours of being announced. Kings and queens competed to have him perform at their courts. His technique was supposedly flawless, his interpretations revolutionary. Of course, the Baron added with a sly smile, true appreciation of such artistry requires a certain level of musical education. Not everyone can distinguish between technical perfection and mere noise. The comment was clearly meant as a slight, a suggestion that Louis lacked the sophistication to appreciate what they were about to witness. It was exactly the kind of subtle insult that made these gatherings so exhausting. Before Louis could respond, a hush fell over the ballroom. King Philippe was calling for attention, his voice carrying easily across the vast space. "My friends," the king began, "tonight we have the honor of welcoming Monsieur Alexander Dubois, whose reputation precedes him across all of Europe." A man stepped forward from the crowd, and Louis felt his breath catch slightly. Dubois was not what he had expected. He was younger than Louis had imagined, perhaps in his early 30s, with dark hair slicked back and an immaculately groomed mustache. He wore a black evening coat that fit perfectly, and his posture radiated confidence. But it was his eyes that struck Louis most forcefully. They were intelligent, certainly, but there was something else there. Pride. Arrogance. A man who knew his worth and expected others to recognize it immediately. Dubois bowed deeply to the king, then turned to address the assembled crowd. When he spoke, his voice carried the polish of someone accustomed to addressing the elite. "Your Majesty, distinguished guests," he began, "I am honored to perform for such an illustrious gathering. Tonight, I hope to share with you not merely music, but art in its purest form." The crowd murmured appreciatively. This was exactly the kind of refined entertainment they expected. Culture and sophistication served alongside their wine and delicate pastries. As servants finished preparing the grand piano that had been positioned in the center of the ballroom, Louis found himself studying Dubois more carefully. There was something in the man's demeanor that bothered him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Perhaps it was the way Dubois's eyes swept over the crowd, as if he were measuring their worth by their ability to appreciate his genius. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dubois announced as he approached the piano, "I shall begin with Bach's Goldberg Variations, followed by Chopin's Ballades, and conclude with my own interpretation of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata." Louis felt a flutter of excitement despite himself. These were pieces he knew well, compositions he had been studying with increasing passion. He would finally have the chance to hear them performed by a master. Dubois settled himself at the piano bench with theatrical precision, adjusting his coat and flexing his fingers. The ballroom fell completely silent, hundreds of people holding their breath in anticipation. When the first notes rang out, Louis understood immediately why Dubois had achieved such fame. The man's technique was indeed flawless. His fingers moved across the keys with mechanical precision, each note clean and perfectly timed. The Goldberg Variations unfolded with mathematical accuracy, every ornament and trill executed exactly as written. But, as the performance continued, Louis began to feel something unexpected. Disappointment. Yes, Dubois was technically perfect. Every note was in its proper place, every rhythm exact. But there was something missing, something that Louis couldn't quite name at first. It took him nearly halfway through the Bach before he realized what bothered him so much. The music had no soul. Dubois played with his mind, not his heart. Every passage was calculated, every dynamic marking followed to the letter. But there was no emotion, no personal interpretation, no sense that the music meant anything to the performer beyond a demonstration of his technical abilities. Louis glanced around the ballroom and saw that the audience was enraptured. They heard the perfect execution and mistook it for artistic genius. But Louis, who had spent hours struggling with these same pieces, who had found in them moments of joy and sorrow and transcendence, could hear the hollow echo beneath Dubois's flawless technique. When Dubois moved into the Chopin ballades, the problem became even more apparent. These were pieces that demanded emotional depth, compositions that Chopin had poured his heart into during some of the most turbulent years of his life. But, under Dubois's fingers, they became mere exercises in technical display. Beautiful exercises, certainly, but empty of the passion that had inspired their creation. Louis found his hands involuntarily moving, his fingers unconsciously following the melodies. He had played these pieces himself, alone in his chambers at night when the castle was quiet, and he could lose himself in the music. He knew how they should sound, how they should feel. He could hear in his mind the way certain passages should breathe, the way others should surge with emotion. As Dubois launched into his interpretation of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, Louis had to resist the urge to leave the room. The first movement, which should have been hauntingly beautiful, came across as merely pretty. The technical challenges of the final movement were handled with ease, but without the dramatic intensity that made them meaningful. When the last note faded away, the ballroom erupted in enthusiastic applause. Guests called out bravo and magnificent with genuine enthusiasm. King Philippe himself was applauding vigorously, clearly pleased with the evening's entertainment. Dubois stood and bowed deeply, clearly basking in the adulation. His smile was one of supreme satisfaction, the look of a man whose expectations of praise had been exceeded. Thank you, he said, raising his hands to quiet the applause. Your appreciation means everything to a humble musician. There was nothing humble about Alexander Dubois, Louis thought to himself. The man radiated self-satisfaction like heat from a fire. As the formal performance concluded and the evening began to transition toward dancing and more casual entertainment, guests clustered around Dubois to offer their congratulations. Louis watched from a distance as duchesses and ambassadors competed for the pianist's attention, each hoping to associate themselves with his obvious genius. Baron de Rochelle appeared at Louis's elbow again, his thin smile even more pronounced than before. Truly magnificent, the Baron said. Such technical perfection. Such sophistication. I suppose it takes years of dedicated study to reach such heights. Indeed, Louis replied noncommittally. Of course, not everyone has the patience for such disciplined pursuit, the Baron continued. Music is such a demanding mistress. She reveals immediately those who are merely pretending to understand her mysteries. Louis understood the subtext perfectly. The Baron was suggesting that someone like Louis, a prince who had never demonstrated any musical ability publicly, would be unable to appreciate or create anything approaching what they had just witnessed. Monsieur Dubois, the Baron called out suddenly, catching the pianist's attention as he finished speaking with the Countess de Montclair. Please, allow me to introduce you to His Royal Highness, Prince Louis. Dubois approached with the same confident bearing he had displayed throughout the evening. Up close, Louis could see that the man's eyes held a calculating intelligence, as if he were constantly assessing how each interaction might benefit him. Your Highness, Dubois said, offering a bow that managed to be both respectful and subtly condescending. I hope my humble performance brought you some small pleasure. It was certainly technically accomplished, Louis replied, choosing his words carefully. Dubois's eyebrows rose slightly, and Louis caught a flash of something sharp in his expression. The pianist had clearly expected unqualified praise, and Louis's measured response had registered as criticism. Technical accomplishment is merely the foundation, Dubois said smoothly. True artistry lies in the interpretation, in breathing life into the composer's intentions. Quite so, Louis agreed. Though I sometimes wonder whether the composer's intentions are always best served by strict adherence to what's written on the page. Baron de Rochelle's eyes lit up with malicious delight. He could sense potential conflict brewing, and nothing entertained him more than watching others stumble into uncomfortable situations. An interesting perspective, Your Highness, Dubois said, his tone cooling slightly. Of course, such questions of interpretation are best left to those who have dedicated their lives to musical study. Amateurs often mistake personal preference for artistic insight. The insult was delicately delivered but unmistakable. Dubois was suggesting that Louis's opinion was worthless because he lacked professional training. Around them, other guests began to take notice of the conversation, sensing tension in the air. Perhaps you're right, Louis said quietly. Professional training certainly provides valuable foundation. Though I've often found that passion can sometimes compensate for formal instruction. Passion without technique is merely noise, Du Bois replied, his smile becoming more strained. Any child can bang on piano keys and claim to be making music. The difference between amateur enthusiasm and true artistry is years of disciplined study under proper masters. Louis felt heat rising in his chest. Du Bois wasn't just dismissing his opinion, he was dismissing the value of everything Louis had discovered in his private musical explorations. The hours he had spent learning to read music, the nights he had wrestled with difficult passages, the moments of pure joy when he had finally managed to bring a piece to life under his own fingers, all of it reduced to banging on piano keys. Certainly technique matters, Louis said, his voice remaining calm despite his growing anger. But, I wonder whether technical perfection without emotional understanding might be equally empty. The conversation was beginning to draw attention from across the ballroom. Guests were discreetly moving closer, sensing that something interesting was developing. Baron de Rochelle looked positively thrilled, clearly anticipating that the young prince was about to embarrass himself thoroughly. Du Bois's mask of politeness finally began to slip. His professional reputation was built on the premise that he represented the pinnacle of musical achievement. Having some untrained royal suggest that his performance lacked emotional understanding was not just insulting, it was potentially damaging to his carefully cultivated image. Your Highness, Du Bois said, his voice taking on a harder edge, perhaps you would care to demonstrate this emotional understanding you speak of? After all, it's easy to criticize when one has never faced the challenge of actual performance. Louis felt the blood drain from his face. Du Bois was challenging him to play, here, in front of the entire court. It was a trap, designed to humiliate him publicly and put him in his place. Everyone would expect him to decline, to make some excuse about not being prepared or not having his music. Alexander, Baron de Rochelle said with false concern, surely you jest. His Highness is hardly prepared for such a spontaneous performance. But, Du Bois had scented blood in the water. His smile returned, but now it was predatory. Of course, I understand completely, he said smoothly. Public performance requires a certain level of preparation that not everyone possesses. Perhaps your Highness would prefer to share his insights on musical interpretation in a more theoretical discussion? Louis looked around the ballroom and saw exactly what Du Bois intended him to see. Hundreds of pairs of eyes watching expectantly. Nobles who had spent the evening bowing and scraping now waiting eagerly to see him fail. His father's concerned expression as the king realized that his son was being maneuvered into an impossible situation. In that moment, Louis understood that everything would change based on what he did next. He could gracefully decline, make some excuse about not wanting to follow such a masterful performance, and retreat to safety. Everyone would understand. No one would blame him for avoiding such an obvious trap. But something inside him rebelled against that safe path. For years, he had hidden his passion for music, keeping it private and protected. For years, he had watched others perform while he remained silent in the shadows. For years, he had accepted that his role was to be the spare prince, the one who stayed quietly in the background while others took center stage. Tonight, watching Du Bois receive thunderous applause for a performance that had no heart, something had crystallized in Louis's mind. Music wasn't just about technical perfection. It wasn't about following rules or impressing audiences with flashy displays of skill. Music was about truth, about finding something real in the chaos of notes and rhythms and expressing it honestly. Louis looked directly into Du Bois's confident eyes and made a decision that would change everything. Very well, monsieur, he said quietly. I accept your challenge. The ballroom fell silent. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Even the servants paused in their duties to stare at the young prince who had just agreed to a musical duel with Europe's most celebrated pianist. Du Bois's expression shifted from confident amusement to genuine surprise. He had expected Louis to back down, to retreat gracefully from an impossible situation. The fact that the prince had accepted his challenge changed everything. Now Du Bois was committed to a course of action that might not go exactly as he had planned. But his confidence quickly returned. After all, what could some untrained royal possibly do against his decades of professional study? The outcome was inevitable. This would be a lesson in the difference between amateur enthusiasm and true artistic achievement. Excellent, Du Bois said, his smile regaining its predatory edge. I look forward to hearing your interpretation of musical emotion. Louis nodded and began walking toward the piano. His heart was pounding, but his steps were steady. Behind him, he could hear the excited murmur of voices as the news of the impromptu challenge spread through the ballroom. He was about to step into the light, to reveal a part of himself he had kept hidden for years. Everything he had discovered about music, about himself, about the truth that could be found in melodies and harmonies, was about to be put to the test in front of the most critical audience imaginable. As he approached the piano bench where Du Bois waited with supreme confidence, Louis took a deep breath and prepared to show the world what real music could sound like when it came from the heart instead of just the head. The challenge had been issued. The gauntlet had been thrown down. Now it was time for Prince Louis to prove that sometimes passion and truth could triumph over technique and arrogance. The real performance was about to begin. The short walk to the piano felt like crossing an ocean. Each step brought Louis closer to a moment that would define not just this evening, but possibly the rest of his life. The crystal chandeliers above cast shifting shadows across the marble floor, and the hundreds of candles flickering throughout the ballroom seemed to pulse with his heartbeat. Behind him, the ballroom buzzed with excitement and speculation. Conversations erupted in hushed, urgent tones as guests tried to understand what was happening. Most had never seen Prince Louis display any musical inclination, and the idea that he would challenge Alexander Du Bois seemed impossible to comprehend. "Is the prince mad?" whispered the Duchess of Normandy to her companion. "Du Bois will destroy him." "Perhaps it's some elaborate joke," suggested Count Beaumont, though his voice carried uncertainty. "Royal humor can be quite complex." "No joke," observed Baron de Rochelle with obvious delight. "The boy has walked directly into a trap of his own making. This will be the most entertaining humiliation I've witnessed in years." King Philippe watched his younger son with growing concern. He knew Louis was intelligent and thoughtful, but this seemed like professional suicide. The boy had never shown any sign of musical talent beyond the basic lessons required of all royal children. Now he was about to pit himself against one of Europe's greatest virtuosos in front of an audience that included ambassadors from half a dozen countries. "Should I intervene?" the king murmured to his aide. "This could become a diplomatic embarrassment." "Perhaps wait, Your Majesty," the aide suggested carefully. "Prince Louis has always been unpredictable, but he's never been foolish." Near the back of the room, Marcel watched his young master with a mixture of pride and terror. He was one of the few people who knew about Louis's secret musical studies, but even he had never imagined the prince would reveal them under such pressure. Marcel had seen Louis practice for hours at night, working through difficult passages with the kind of determination he applied to everything that truly mattered to him. But practicing alone in private chambers was vastly different from performing in front of a hostile audience. As Louis reached the piano, Du Bois stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy, his confident smile never wavering. Up close, the piano looked massive and intimidating. It was a magnificent instrument, a Pleyel grand piano that had been specially tuned for this evening's performance. The keys gleamed white as ivory in the candlelight, and the polished ebony case reflected the surrounding grandeur of the ballroom. Louis placed his hands lightly on the fallboard, feeling the smooth wood beneath his fingers. For a moment, he simply stood there, letting the reality of the situation settle over him. In less than 5 minutes, he would either vindicate everything he believed about music and truth, or he would humiliate himself so thoroughly that he might never recover. "Take your time, Your Highness," Du Bois said with false generosity. "I understand that public performance can be overwhelming for the inexperienced." Louis looked up at the famous pianist and saw something that surprised him. Beneath Du Bois's confident exterior, there was a flicker of genuine nervousness. The man had built his reputation on being unquestionably the finest pianist of his generation. Having some untrained prince accept his challenge had created an unexpected variable in what should have been a simple demonstration of superior skill. If Louis played badly, as everyone expected, Du Bois would win. But he would win by defeating someone who had no business being on the same stage. It would be like a master swordsman cutting down a child. Victory without honor. If, impossibly, Louis played well, then Du Bois's entire worldview would be challenged. How could someone without proper training, without years of disciplined study under recognized masters, produce anything approaching real music? "Thank you for your patience," Louis replied quietly. "I was simply deciding what to play." This was the crucial moment. Louis had to choose a piece that would serve his purposes perfectly. It couldn't be something so technically difficult that his limitations would be immediately exposed. But it couldn't be so simple that it would seem like he was avoiding the challenge. Most importantly, it had to be something that would allow him to demonstrate the emotional depth he believed Dubois's performance had lacked. His mind raced through the repertoire he had studied over the past 3 years. Bach was too mathematical, too focused on structure rather than emotion. Chopin would invite direct comparison to what Dubois had just performed. Mozart felt too light for the gravity of this moment. Then, suddenly, he knew exactly what to play. Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 14 in C-sharp minor, Op. 27, No. 2. The Moonlight Sonata that Dubois had performed earlier in the evening. But Louis wouldn't play all 3 movements as Dubois had done. He would focus on the first movement, the Adagio sostenuto that had made the sonata famous throughout the world. It was a risky choice. Playing the same piece that Dubois had just performed would invite direct comparison. Everyone in the room would be able to judge immediately which interpretation they preferred. But that was exactly what Louis wanted. He was making a statement about the difference between technical perfection and emotional truth. "I believe I'll play the first movement of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata," Louis announced, his voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. A murmur of surprise rippled through the audience. Playing the same piece Dubois had just performed was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. Perhaps both. Dubois's eyebrows rose, and his smile became more pronounced. "An excellent choice, Your Highness. A true test of interpretation versus the original." Louis ignored the implied insult and seated himself at the piano bench. He adjusted his position carefully, feeling the familiar weight of his hands as they settled into position above the keys. For a moment, he closed his eyes and tried to shut out the hundreds of watching faces, the weight of expectation and judgment that pressed down on him from every direction. Instead, he thought about why this piece mattered to him. The first movement of the Moonlight Sonata wasn't just a beautiful melody. It was Beethoven's attempt to capture something ineffable about human longing and melancholy. The composer had written it during a period of personal crisis, when his hearing was beginning to fail and he was falling in love with a student he could never marry. Louis had spent countless hours studying this piece, not just learning the notes but trying to understand what Beethoven had been feeling when he wrote it. The opening measures were marked Adagio sostenuto and Si devo suonare tutto questo pezzo delicatissimamente e senza sordino. The entire piece should be played very delicately and without dampers. But what did that really mean? Louis had come to understand that Beethoven wasn't just giving technical instructions. He was asking the performer to approach the music with emotional vulnerability, to play as if every note mattered personally. When Dubois had performed the piece earlier, he had followed the markings precisely. Every note had been delicate, every phrase carefully shaped. But there had been no sense that the music meant anything to him personally. It was like watching someone read a love letter written by someone else to someone else. Technically perfect, but emotionally empty. Louis opened his eyes and looked down at the keys. The famous opening measures required the right hand to play a simple melody while the left hand provided a steady accompaniment of broken chords. Technically, it wasn't the most difficult music ever written. But, emotionally, it demanded everything the performer had to give. He placed his hands in position and took a deep breath. The ballroom was completely silent now. Even the servants had stopped moving, creating a stillness so complete that Louis could hear his own heartbeat. And then, he began to play. The first note rang out pure and clear, a C-sharp that seemed to hang in the air like a question waiting for an answer. Louis let it sustain, feeling its resonance through the piano and into his bones. Then came the second note, and the third, building the haunting melody that had captivated audiences for decades. But, from the very first measure, it was clear that something different was happening. Where Dubois had played with mechanical precision, Louis played with organic breathing. Where Dubois had followed the dynamics exactly as written, Louis found subtle variations that seemed to emerge naturally from the music itself. Most importantly, where Dubois had performed, Louis was communicating. The melody in the right hand wasn't just a sequence of notes anymore. It was a voice, speaking directly to everyone in the room about longing and loss and the strange beauty that could be found in sadness. Louis's fingers found colors and textures that had been hidden beneath Dubois's technical perfection. The left-hand accompaniment, which had sounded like a metronome under Dubois's performance, became a heartbeat under Louis's touch. Sometimes steady and strong, sometimes hesitant and uncertain, always perfectly synchronized with the emotional content of the melody above. As Louis moved through the first page of the score, something remarkable began to happen in the ballroom. The restless energy that had characterized the evening, the constant movement of fans, the rustle of silk gowns, the quiet conversations in corners, all of it gradually stilled. People found themselves holding their breath, afraid that any sound might break the spell being woven by the young prince at the piano. Baron de Rochelle, who had been anticipating a humiliating spectacle, felt his mocking smile fade. The music washing over him was unlike anything he had heard before. It was the same notes Du Bois had played, but somehow completely different. Where Du Bois had demonstrated his mastery of the instrument, Louis was demonstrating his understanding of the human heart. Near the front of the room, King Philippe felt tears gathering in his eyes. He had never known that his younger son possessed this gift, this ability to transform mere notes into something that spoke directly to the soul. The boy he had watched grow up, quiet and thoughtful and always slightly removed from the world around him, was revealing depths that Philippe had never suspected. Du Bois himself was experiencing something he had never felt before, doubt. As he watched Louis's hands move across the keys with natural grace, as he heard interpretations that made him question his own understanding of pieces he had played hundreds of times, Alexander Du Bois began to wonder whether everything he thought he knew about music might be wrong. The technical execution was far from perfect. Louis occasionally hesitated slightly before difficult passages, and his fingerwork wasn't as clean as it could have been. But, somehow, these small imperfections made the music more human, more honest. They were evidence of a real person struggling to express something important, rather than a machine executing programmed instructions flawlessly. As Louis approached the development section of the movement, where Beethoven had written some of his most emotionally complex harmonic progressions, the difference between the two performances became even more pronounced. Du Bois had played these passages as intellectual puzzles to be solved, demonstrating his ability to navigate complex key relationships with ease. Louis played them as emotional landscapes to be explored. Each modulation became a journey from one feeling to another. The temporary moments of major key brightness weren't just harmonic relief, they were glimpses of hope breaking through melancholy. The chromatic passages weren't just technical challenges, they were representations of the confusion and uncertainty that accompanied deep feeling. Halfway through the movement, something unprecedented happened in the ballroom. People began to cry. It started with the Countess de Montclair, who had spent years perfecting a mask of aristocratic indifference. The music somehow reached past all her carefully constructed defenses and touched something raw and vulnerable that she had forgotten she possessed. Tears began streaming down her cheeks, and she made no attempt to wipe them away. Lord Beaumont, who had built his fortune on the suffering of factory workers and had long ago convinced himself that compassion was a luxury he couldn't afford, felt his chest tighten with unfamiliar emotion. The music was showing him something about himself that he had spent decades trying to hide. Even servants, who were trained to remain invisible during such gatherings, found themselves deeply moved. Marcel watched his young master with pride so intense it was almost painful. He had known Louis was gifted, but this was something beyond talent. This was genius revealing itself for the first time. As Louis entered the final section of the movement, building toward the climactic high notes that would resolve back to the opening melody, every person in the ballroom was completely absorbed in the musical journey he was creating. The notes seemed to hang in the air like living things, each one perfectly placed and perfectly weighted. The famous repeated notes in the melody, which had sounded merely pretty under Du Bois's fingers, became urgent communications. They were Beethoven speaking across the centuries, using Louis as his voice to share something essential about what it meant to be human. And then, as the movement approached its conclusion, Louis did something that no one expected. Instead of ending with the traditional diminuendo that would let the music fade away gently, he found a different interpretation. The final phrases became not a fade to silence, but a transformation. The melancholy that had characterized the entire movement was gradually replaced by something that wasn't quite happiness, but wasn't despair either. It was acceptance, understanding, peace. The last chord hung in the air for what felt like an eternity. Louis kept his hands on the keys, his head slightly bowed, letting the resonance fade naturally until perfect silence returned to the ballroom. For several seconds, no one moved. No one breathed. The music had created a space outside of normal time, and everyone was reluctant to break the spell by returning to the ordinary world. Then, slowly, people began to realize what they had just witnessed. This hadn't been a musical performance in the conventional sense. This had been a revelation. A young prince who had been hiding extraordinary gifts had chosen this moment, under the most pressure imaginable, to share something profoundly beautiful with the world. The silence stretched on, filled with the kind of tension that precedes either thunderous applause or shocked disapproval. Louis remained at the piano, his hands still resting on the keys, waiting to discover whether his gamble had succeeded or failed spectacularly. What happened next would determine not just the outcome of his challenge with Dubois, but the entire trajectory of his future life. The silence that followed Louis's performance was unlike anything the Grand Ballroom had ever held. It wasn't the polite quiet that preceded applause, nor the awkward stillness that followed a disappointing show. This was something deeper, more profound. It was the silence of people whose fundamental understanding of the world had just been challenged. Louis remained seated at the piano, his hands still resting lightly on the keys. He could feel his heart pounding against his ribs, but his breathing was steady. Whatever happened next, he had done what he set out to do. He had played with complete honesty, holding nothing back, sharing the deepest part of himself with a room full of strangers. The first sound to break the silence was unexpected. It came from the back of the ballroom, near the servants' entrance. Marcel, who had watched his young master grow from a confused boy into the remarkable young man seated at the piano, began to clap. His applause was slow, measured, and filled with such obvious emotion that it carried clearly across the vast space. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had held the room captive. Suddenly, everyone was moving, breathing, reacting. But their responses were far from uniform. Near the front of the ballroom, King Philippe was struggling with emotions he hadn't felt since his wife's death. The music had reminded him of her somehow, of quiet evenings when they would sit together while she played their old piano. But this was different. This was his son, his quiet younger son who had never seemed to excel at anything, revealing depths of talent and sensitivity that left the king feeling as if he were meeting Louis for the first time. "Mon Dieu," the king whispered, his voice barely audible. "I never knew." Around him, the reactions were equally intense but wildly varied. The Countess de Montclair was still crying, but she seemed unaware of her tears. She was staring at Louis with an expression of wonder, as if she had just witnessed something miraculous. "That was..." She began, then stopped, unable to find words adequate to what she had just experienced. Lord Beaumont was having a very different reaction. The music had moved him deeply, but he was struggling against those feelings. A man who had spent years building emotional walls to justify his business practices couldn't afford to let some pretty music tear down his defenses. He forced his face back into its usual mask of aristocratic indifference, but his hands were shaking slightly. "Quite adequate," he said loudly, his voice carrying an edge of desperation. "For an amateur effort." But even as he spoke, he could hear the hollow ring of his own words. What Louis had just done was far beyond adequate. It was extraordinary, and everyone in the room knew it. Baron de Rochelle was experiencing something approaching panic. He had orchestrated this entire situation specifically to humiliate Prince Louis, to put the quiet royal in his place and provide entertainment for the court's elite. Instead, he had accidentally created a platform for Louis to demonstrate abilities that made everyone else in the room seem small by comparison. "Technical errors," the Baron said quickly, trying to salvage something from the wreckage of his plans. "Quite a few technical errors. Charming in its way, I suppose, but hardly professional standard." But his criticism fell flat. Everyone who had heard both performances could distinguish between Dubois's mechanical perfection and Louis's emotional honesty. The few technical imperfections in Louis's playing had only made it more human, more real. Alexander Dubois was having the most complex reaction of anyone in the room. As a professional musician, he could appreciate the technical aspects of what Louis had done. The prince's finger work wasn't flawless, his tempo wasn't perfectly steady, and his dynamic control could have been more precise. But, as someone who had dedicated his life to music, Dubois was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Despite all his training, all his technical mastery, all his professional achievements, he had never produced anything that approached the emotional impact of what he had just heard. For the first time in his career, Alexander Dubois was experiencing musical jealousy. Not jealousy of technique or training or reputation, but jealousy of something much deeper. He was jealous of Louis's ability to connect with music on a level that seemed to bypass all the formal structures Dubois had spent years mastering. "Interesting interpretation," Dubois said carefully, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. Though perhaps a bit undisciplined. But even as he spoke, he could see in Louis's eyes that the young prince understood exactly what was happening. Louis wasn't being fooled by the criticism. He could see the conflict playing out in Dubois's expression, the struggle between professional pride and artistic honesty. As the immediate reactions died down, a different kind of response began to emerge. The guests who had been moved by Lewis's performance started to approach the piano, drawn by a desire to somehow be closer to what they had just experienced. The first was an elderly woman whom Lewis recognized as the Duchess of Brittany. She was known throughout the court for her sharp tongue and her impatience with anything she considered frivolous. But, as she approached Lewis, her usual severity was replaced by something approaching awe. "Your Highness," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "That was the most beautiful thing I have heard in 40 years of attending court concerts." Behind her came others, creating an informal receiving line of people who wanted to express their appreciation. A young diplomat from Prussia who had seemed bored throughout Dubois's performance was practically vibrating with excitement. "The way you found those inner voices in the accompaniment," he said rapidly. "I never realized they were there. It was like hearing the piece for the first time." An ambassador from Austria, a man known for his extensive musical knowledge, was shaking his head in amazement. "Mozart's homeland has produced many fine musicians," he said, "but I have rarely heard such instinctive musicality. You seem to understand something about interpretation that cannot be taught." Each compliment, each expression of genuine appreciation, was like a physical blow to Dubois's ego. His entire identity was built on being the finest pianist of his generation, the musician that others aspired to emulate. Having a room full of sophisticated listeners prefer some untrained prince's amateur efforts was calling everything into question. But, perhaps the most significant reaction came from someone Lewis hadn't noticed before. Near the windows, partially hidden by the heavy velvet curtains, stood an elderly man in a simple black coat. Unlike the elaborately dressed nobility around him, this man's clothing was modest, almost austere. But, there was something in his bearing that commanded attention. As the crowd around Lewis began to thin, this mysterious figure approached the piano. When he spoke, his accent revealed him to be German, and his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to carefully. "Young man," he said quietly, "may I ask where you studied?" Lewis looked up at him, noting the intelligence in the man's eyes and the calloused condition of his hands. These were a musician's hands, someone who had spent decades working at his craft. "I haven't studied formally, sir," Lewis replied honestly. "I've been learning on my own, with some guidance from the court music master." The man's eyebrows rose. "And how long have you been playing?" "Seriously?" "Perhaps 3 years." The man was quiet for a long moment, studying Lewis with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. Then, he nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had suspected. "I am Johann Hummel," he said simply. Lewis felt his breath catch. Johann Hummel was one of the most respected composers and pianists in all of Europe. A student of Mozart, a friend of Beethoven, a musician whose compositions were played in concert halls from Vienna to London. Having him appear at this provincial French court was unexpected enough. Having him take interest in Lewis's playing was almost unbelievable. "Herr Hummel," Lewis managed, trying to stand and bow properly despite his shock. Hummel waved him back down. "Please, remain seated. I have a proposition for you." Around them, the other guests were beginning to take notice of this conversation. Word spread quickly through the ballroom that the famous composer was speaking privately with Prince Louis, adding another layer of excitement to an already extraordinary evening. "I am traveling to Vienna next month," Hummel continued. "I maintain a small school there for exceptionally talented students. Would you consider joining us?" Louis stared at him, certain he had misheard. "Sir, I'm not sure I understand." "You're offering to teach me?" "I'm offering you the opportunity to develop gifts that are already remarkable," Hummel replied. "What I heard tonight was not the product of technical training. It was the expression of natural musical intelligence that cannot be learned from books or exercises. But, it can be refined, guided, helped to reach its full potential." The conversation was taking place within earshot of dozens of people, including Dubois, who was watching with growing dismay. Having Johann Hummel offer to teach Prince Louis was an endorsement that carried enormous weight throughout the musical world. It was validation that what they had all just witnessed was not some fluke, but evidence of genuine artistic talent. "I would be honored," Louis said quietly. "But, I'm not sure such an arrangement would be possible. My father has already given his permission," came King Philippe's voice from behind them. Louis turned to see his father approaching, having overheard enough of the conversation to understand what was being offered. "You knew Herr Hummel would be here?" Louis asked, confused. "I invited him," the king replied. "Though not for this purpose. I had hoped to commission a new composition for the Queen's birthday celebration next year. I had no idea I would be arranging for my son's musical education instead." Hummel smiled. "The composition can still be arranged, Your Majesty. But I suspect that having your son as a student will prove far more valuable than any single piece I might write." The implications of this conversation were beginning to sink in throughout the ballroom. Prince Louis wasn't just talented, he was so talented that one of Europe's greatest composers wanted to teach him personally. The evening that had begun as a routine court entertainment was transforming into something that would be talked about for years. But not everyone was pleased by these developments. Dubois was struggling with the realization that his attempt to humiliate an amateur had instead revealed gifts that surpassed his own. Baron de Rochelle was watching his carefully laid plans for Louis's embarrassment crumble into dust. Several other courtiers who had been looking forward to witnessing a royal failure were having to adjust their expectations dramatically. "Perhaps," Dubois said loudly, trying to regain control of the situation, "we should remember that one performance, however charming, hardly constitutes a complete musical education. There are years of repertoire to master, techniques to develop, theoretical knowledge to acquire." Hummel turned to look at Dubois with mild interest, as if noticing him for the first time. "You are quite right," Hummel said pleasantly. "A complete musical education requires extensive study. That is why I have dedicated my life to teaching. Though I must say, I have found that students who begin with genuine musical instinct learn far more quickly than those who start with only technical ambition." The comment was politely delivered, but its implications were clear to everyone in the room. Hummel was distinguishing between musicians like Louis, who understood music instinctively, and musicians like Dubois, whose approach was primarily technical. Dubois's face flushed red. Being dismissed by Johann Hummel in front of a room full of aristocrats was a professional disaster. His reputation depended on being recognized as the finest pianist of his generation, and that reputation was crumbling with each passing minute. "I suppose," Dubois said tightly, "that different teachers have different standards." The insult was barely concealed. Dubois was suggesting that Hummel's standards weren't rigorous enough, that his willingness to teach Louis indicated a lack of proper discrimination. The ballroom fell silent again, but this time the tension was different. This wasn't the odd silence that had followed Louis's performance. This was the electric quiet that preceded either violence or humiliation. Johann Hummel was known throughout Europe not just for his musical genius, but for his quick wit and sharp tongue. Having some provincial pianist question his judgment was not something he was likely to tolerate gracefully. "Indeed," Hummel said softly, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Different teachers do have different standards. Some focus on producing musicians who can play notes accurately. Others aspire to nurture artists who can touch souls." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I prefer the latter approach, though I understand it requires recognizing the difference between technique and artistry. Not everyone possesses that ability." The rebuke was devastating precisely because it was so politely delivered. Hummel wasn't shouting or losing his temper. He was simply stating facts with the authority of someone whose opinion carried weight throughout the musical world. Dubois realized that he had lost completely. Not only had his attempt to humiliate Prince Louis backfired spectacularly, but he had also managed to insult one of the most respected musicians in Europe. His evening, which had begun with such promise, was ending in professional ruin. But the damage wasn't limited to Dubois. The entire social dynamic of the evening had shifted. Prince Louis, who had entered the ballroom as a quiet spare heir, was suddenly the center of attention for all the right reasons. Guests who had barely acknowledged him before were now eager to associate themselves with his success. As the evening continued and the immediate excitement began to settle into ongoing conversation, Louis found himself experiencing something completely new. For the first time in his life, he was being recognized not for his title or his family connections, but for something he had actually accomplished. The transformation was intoxicating, but also slightly overwhelming. He had spent so many years being invisible, being the spare prince who stayed in the background while others commanded attention. Now, suddenly, everyone wanted to talk to him, to be near him, to bask in the reflected glory of his artistic triumph. But even as he enjoyed the attention and validation, Louis was already thinking ahead. Hummel's offer represented an opportunity beyond anything he had ever imagined. The chance to study with one of the great masters, to develop his gifts under proper guidance, to perhaps even build a life around music rather than royal obligations. As the evening wound down and guests began making their departures, Louis realized that everything had changed. He was no longer just the spare prince, the quiet younger son who would live in his brother's shadow. He was Prince Louis the musician, a young man with extraordinary gifts and unprecedented opportunities. The challenge that Du Bois had issued as an insult had become the catalyst for Louis's transformation. Sometimes, the best way to discover what you're capable of is to be pushed into a situation where you have no choice but to reveal your true self. The piano duel was over. But, for Prince Louis, the real music was just beginning. The days following the confrontation with Du Bois passed in a whirlwind of activity that Louis had never experienced before. Word of his remarkable performance spread through the French court with the speed of wildfire, and, then, beyond, carried by the ambassadors and visiting dignitaries who had witnessed the evening firsthand. By the third morning after the concert, letters were arriving from across Europe. Musicians, composers, and music lovers who had heard reports of the young prince's extraordinary abilities were writing to request private performances, to offer instruction, or simply to express their amazement at what they had heard described. Louis sat in his private chambers, surrounded by correspondence that would have overwhelmed him just a week earlier. But something fundamental had changed in him during those few minutes at the piano. The quiet, uncertain young man who had hidden his musical passion was being replaced by someone who was beginning to understand his own potential. Marcel entered the room carrying another stack of letters, his expression a mixture of pride and bewilderment. "More correspondence, Your Highness," he said, setting the letters on Louis's desk. "Including one from the Emperor in Vienna. He's heard reports of your performance and wishes to invite you to play at court." Louis picked up the imperial letter, noting the elaborate seal and formal parchment. A month ago, receiving personal correspondence from the Austrian emperor would have terrified him. Now it simply seemed like another opportunity to share the music that had become the center of his world. "What else?" he asked, scanning through the other letters. 3 offers from music publishers who want to commission compositions. 2 invitations from conservatories in Berlin and Paris. And... Marcel paused, looking slightly uncomfortable. "And, what?" "A rather unpleasant letter from Monsieur Du Bois." Louis set down the imperial correspondence and looked up at his valet. "What does he say?" Marcel handed over a letter written on expensive paper but with noticeably shaky handwriting. As Louis read, his expression grew increasingly serious. Du Bois had written what amounted to a challenge to a formal musical duel, to be held in Paris before a panel of professional judges. He claimed that the enthusiasm of the French court had been based on novelty rather than genuine musical merit, and that a proper evaluation of Louis's abilities required expert assessment rather than the emotional reactions of amateur listeners. "He's trying to salvage his reputation," Louis said quietly, setting the letter aside. "Will you accept?" Marcel asked. Louis was quiet for a moment, considering. The smart political move would be to decline gracefully. He had already achieved more than anyone had expected, and there was no need to risk everything in another confrontation with a professional musician. Du Bois would have had time to prepare, to practice pieces specifically designed to showcase his technical superiority. But something in Louis rebelled against the safe choice. Music had become more than just a hobby or even a talent. It was becoming his identity, his path towards something meaningful. If he backed down now, he would always wonder whether his success at court had been real or just a fortunate accident. "Draft a reply accepting his challenge," Louis said finally. "But, with conditions." Marcel raised an eyebrow. "What conditions, Your Highness?" "The judges must include Johann Hummel. And the performance must be open to the public, not just professional musicians. Music isn't just for experts. If I'm going to prove something, I want to prove it to everyone." Over the next several days, as the details of the Paris duel were being arranged, Louis threw himself into preparation with an intensity that surprised even him. He had always been a dedicated student, but this was different. This was preparation for something that would define the rest of his life. His practice sessions, which had once been private and hidden, became events in themselves. Word spread through the castle that Prince Louis was preparing for a musical duel in Paris, and, suddenly, his chambers were receiving visitors who had never shown any interest in his activities before. His brother Henri was among the first to appear. The heir to the throne had heard about Louis's triumph from multiple sources, and his reaction was characteristically complex. "So my quiet little brother has been hiding talents all this time," Henri said, settling into a chair near the piano. "Father is beside himself with pride and excitement." "It wasn't intentional deception," Louis replied, pausing in his practice of a particularly challenging Bach fugue. "I simply didn't think anyone would be interested." Henri studied his younger brother with new attention. Throughout their childhood, Henri had been the one who excelled at everything expected of a future king. Languages, diplomacy, military strategy, court politics, all of it came naturally to him. Louis had always seemed content to remain in the background, avoiding attention and responsibility. "This changes things, you know," Henri said seriously. "You're not just my spare brother anymore. People are talking about you across Europe. That kind of recognition brings obligations." Louis had been thinking about the same thing. Success brought opportunities, but it also brought pressures and expectations. The freedom he had found in music was now becoming entangled with politics and public opinion. "I know," he said quietly. "But I can't let that stop me from pursuing what matters to me." Henri nodded slowly. Despite the competitive dynamic that often existed between royal siblings, he genuinely wanted Louis to succeed. Having a famous musician for a brother could only enhance the prestige of the French royal family. "Then, make sure you win this duel," Henri said firmly. "Because if you're going to claim this identity, you need to defend it successfully." The advice was practical and supportive, but it also carried weight that Louis felt in his chest. This wasn't just about personal satisfaction anymore. The reputation of the royal family, the pride of the French court, and his own future were all riding on what happened in Paris. As the days passed and the date of the duel approached, Louis's preparation took on new dimensions. Johann Hummel arrived from Vienna earlier than planned, ostensibly to serve as one of the judges but actually to provide intensive coaching for Louis. Their first lesson together was a revelation. Where Louis had been largely self-taught, working through pieces by instinct and ear, Hummel brought the perspective of someone who understood music from every possible angle. "Your interpretive instincts are remarkable," Hummel said after listening to Louis play through the Bach fugue he had been practicing. "But your technical foundation has gaps that could become problems under pressure." They worked together for hours each day, with Hummel pushing Louis to refine aspects of his technique that he had never considered. Finger independence, pedaling technique, the subtle art of voicing chords so that important melodic lines emerged clearly, all of these became subjects of intense focus. But, perhaps most importantly, Hummel helped Louis understand how to prepare mentally for high-pressure performance. "Technical mastery is important," Hummel explained during one of their sessions. "But, the difference between good musicians and great ones is the ability to maintain emotional connection to the music even when under extreme stress. Dubois will try to intimidate you, to make you doubt yourself. You must learn to use that pressure as energy rather than allowing it to become paralysis." As word of the upcoming duel spread, it began to take on significance far beyond a simple musical competition. The French court saw it as a matter of national pride. The story of a young prince challenging an established virtuoso captured the public imagination in a way that surprised everyone. Letters of support arrived from unexpected sources. Common citizens who had never attended a court concert wrote to express their hope that Louis would prove that musical genius could emerge from anywhere. Musicians from across Europe took sides, with some supporting Dubois's claims about the importance of formal training while others rallied behind Louis's more intuitive approach. The pressure was enormous, but Louis found that it clarified rather than confused his purpose. He wasn't just playing for himself anymore. He was representing something larger, the idea that authentic artistic expression could triumph over mere technical display. 3 days before the scheduled duel, an unexpected visitor arrived at the castle. Alexander Dubois himself appeared, requesting a private audience with Prince Louis. Louis agreed to meet him in the music room where he had been practicing. When Dubois entered, he looked different than he had on the night of their first confrontation. The supreme confidence was gone, replaced by something more uncertain and vulnerable. "Your Highness," Dubois began, "I want to withdraw my challenge." Louis looked up from the piano where he had been working through a Chopin nocturne. "Why?" Dubois was quiet for a long moment, seeming to struggle with what to say. Finally, he sank into a chair and spoke more honestly than he had probably intended. "Because I'm going to lose," he said simply. "Not necessarily in terms of technical perfection, I may still play more cleanly than you do. But you have something I've never had. You have a connection to music that goes beyond training and technique. When you play, people hear something real. When I play, they hear competence. It was a remarkable admission from someone whose entire career was built on claims of artistic superiority. Lewis found himself feeling sympathy for the older musician rather than triumph over his confession. Music isn't a competition, Lewis said gently. There's room for different approaches, different gifts. Perhaps, Du Bois replied. But, I've spent my entire life believing that mastery meant control, that the best musician was the one who could execute the most difficult pieces flawlessly. You've shown me that mastery might mean something completely different. They talked for nearly an hour, with Du Bois asking questions about how Lewis approached interpretation, how he found emotional meaning in technical passages, how he maintained spontaneity while still respecting the composer's intentions. By the end of their conversation, both men had gained new respect for each other. Du Bois left still planning to proceed with the duel, but with a different understanding of what they would be competing for. It wasn't about proving superiority anymore. It was about demonstrating different ways of approaching musical truth. The night before their departure for Paris, Lewis sat alone in his chambers, looking out at the moonlit gardens below. Tomorrow he would travel to the capital, where in 3 days he would face the most important musical challenge of his life. He thought about the young man who had hidden his musical passion just weeks earlier, afraid that others would see it as frivolous or unworthy of royal attention. That person seemed like a stranger now. Music had given him not just an outlet for expression, but a sense of purpose and identity that he had never expected to find. Whatever happened in Paris, Lewis knew that his life had been permanently changed. The quiet prince who avoided attention was gone, replaced by someone willing to take risks for something he believed in. Marcel entered the room to help with final preparations for the journey. As they reviewed the travel arrangements, he looked at his young master with obvious pride. "Are you nervous, Your Highness?" Marcel asked. Lewis considered the question seriously. He felt many things: excitement, anticipation, determination. But nervous wasn't quite right. "No," he said finally. "I'm ready." And, for the first time in his life, Prince Louis truly was ready. Ready to claim his place as a musician. Ready to defend what he had discovered about the power of authentic artistic expression. Ready to show the world what could happen when someone played music not just with their hands, but with their heart. The journey to Paris would begin at dawn. The duel would take place in 3 days. But the real test had already begun the moment Louis decided that music was worth fighting for.